Forms. We can use a lot of different form elements with Bootstrap 4. Here we see first different examples of inputs. We have text inputs, we have some number and date inputs, we have a color input, a text area, a select input, file input, range input, checkboxes and radio buttons. Then we have different layout options. We have an inline form, we have form layout built with grid classes, and we have a small default and a large input. And then we have some different styles for the inputs. We have the disabled style, a read-only style, another read-only style, styled as plain text. Then we have some options for help text for our inputs. And then we have different custom form elements. We have the custom checkbox and radio buttons. We have a custom select and custom file input. And finally, we have different options for validation of our forms. Let's see how we create this. We go into our code editor. A form must have the form tag around it with some other attributes as well for the action required when the user is submitting, but that's a little out of the scope for this course. Inside this, for each input, we'll wrap it in a div element with the class form group. Inside this, we first create our label with the for attribute being the value of our input. So we'll just write example input and give it a name to the label. And then we want to create the input, which is an input tag with the type attribute, which can be a lot of different things. We start with text, and then the class form control. We can use a placeholder attribute with some help text, and we'll give it the ID, which should match our for attribute from the label element. So this should be example input. Now we can see the result to the right. We see that this is also responsive, taking the full width of the parent element. Let's see the different types of inputs that we have. This was for text. The next one we want to have a look at is for search. We simply change the value of our type attribute to search. Then we have one for email. We change the type to email. Then we have one for a URL, like a web address. We change the type attribute to URL. Then we have one for phone numbers. We change the type attribute to tel. Then we have one for passwords. We change the input type to password. Then we have one for numbers. We change the type value to number. Then we have one for date and time. We change the type to date time dash local. And then we have one just for the date with the type date, and just for the month with the type month, and for the week with the type week, and for the time with the type time, and a color input with the type color. So what is the difference in all these? This all depends on your browser or whether you're on a desktop device or mobile device. So it will give you different options for input and will also help you in the validation later on. For example, with our text input, I can write whatever I want. Also in the search. In the email, I can also write whatever I want, but if this was a smartphone, you would see a special email keyboard appearing on the screen. You can also type most anything in the URL and the telephone. However, in the password we now see a change because all the characters are disguised and replaced with dots. In the number we can't type any text, only numbers. In the date time local we can easily select a date by using this calendar pop-up, and also set the time as well. Something similar is true for the date input down here, and for the month input, and for the week input, and here we can input the time, and finally the color input gives us this color wheel where we can choose from. Okay, now let's look at other kinds of input. We have a text area input. Here we need to change the input tag to a text area tag, and we also need to close this tag. This has one more useful attribute, which is the rows attribute, where we can define the height of this. When we see the example here, it's not that high. For example, we can write 5, now it'll be 5 lines or 5 rows high, and we can input text in here. To create a select input, we'll just create the form group wrapper again. Like so. And then we'll create a label for example input. Now we need to create the select tag with the class form control and the ID example input again. Inside this select tag we place our options with a value and also some text content. So for example, like this. Let's have a quick look. Here we see our options. We could also create an empty one with some help text, for example just select, and it would look like this. There was a mistake. Now it should work. It will look like this. To make one of them pre-selected, we can use the selected attribute. For example, let's make the option 2 pre-selected. Now we see that it's pre-selected for the user. We can also make this a select multiple control. So we just add the class or the attribute multiple to the select tag. Now it's possible to select several of these by holding down the command key if you're on the Mac. Great. Let's look at the file input. We also need the wrapping form group element, and then the label, the for attribute, the ID of our input here, which should have the type file. Now the class needs to be a little different. We should use the form control file class and not just form control class. And we still have to use this ID as well. Now we can see we have a file input that lets us access our files on our local computer. Alright, the next input we want to have a look at is range input. We'll just copy this text from our file input. We need to change the input type to range, and also here we have a special class which is form control range. Now we see that we have our range slider here. Okay, great. Now we will have a look at checkboxes. First we'll see how they are built when they are stacked. Once again, we have a wrapping element, but this should not be called form group, but form check. So it's a little different. Inside this, we create a label with the class form check label. And we won't add any ID or for attribute here, since we'll place our label input inside, or our input element inside the label. So the input automatically belongs to this label. It looks like this with the input. And now we use the type checkbox with the class form check input. We give it an ID and a value, and then some text. So once again, we have the input inside our label, and because of this, we don't need a for attribute in our label element. Let's just copy this a few times. Like so. Now when we scroll down, we see that we have our inputs here. To make an input disabled, we simply add the attribute disabled. When we look at it now, we'll see that we can't click it, we can only click the other two inputs. Okay, let's see how we can create an inline style out of this. Actually, we just have to add the class to our form check elements, form check inline. Now we'll see that they are placed inline next to each other. Alright, let's see an example of how we can create a checkbox without a label. I'll just copy the code from before with a normal form check here. So we'll remove the text from our label, and then instead of that we'll create the area label attribute with our label inside as the value. For example, option 4. This would be how we would create it without any text label. Great. Now let's see how this will work for radio buttons. We'll just use the same code since this is very similar. So first we'll move the form check inline classes. To create radio buttons, we'll still use the form check class and the form check label class. And then for the input type, we'll change this from checkbox to radio. We also need to add a name attribute with a common name for this group of buttons. So we'll just call it example radios. And they all need an ID and value as well. Let's take a look. Here we see our 3 different radio buttons, and the last one is still disabled like we saw from before with the attribute disabled. If we want to make one of them checked from the start, we can add the attribute checked. So let's do that for option 2. And when we scroll down, we see that option 2 is being selected. If we want to make these inline, we can do this again by adding a class to the form check element. And this class is once again form check inline. Now we can see that they appear inline. Great. Finally, to create a radio button without a label, we will do just like before. We have the code down here and we change the type to radio, and we should also add a name related to the group that this radio button belongs to. Now it belongs to the other group, but it doesn't have a label. This was all of the different input types that you can use. Now we want to have a look on different styling options. Before we continue, I'll just remove all of this code so we get a better overview.